The courtroom fell silent as the judge laughed at the black woman before him, but then he froze when she pulled out her card. "You think you know the law better than I do?" Judge Leonard Hawkins smirked, his tone dripping with arrogance as he leaned back in his chair. The Jefferson County courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on the black woman standing at the podium. Calm. She did not blink, did not waver. Instead, she met the judge's contemptuous gaze with quiet strength. She was keeping a secret, one that, in a few minutes, would change the course of the trial. The morning light streamed through the high-arched windows of the courthouse, casting long streaks of light across the polished wood. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, as if everyone could sense that this was no ordinary trial. Sitting at the defendant's table, Jason Carter, a young man in his early 20s, held on to the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him afloat during the storm. His tall, bright-eyed frame now looked weary from weeks of trumped-up charges. Beside him, his sister Danielle Carter sat bolt upright, her hands clasped together on the table. At 38, she carried herself with a commanding presence. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was used to dealing with people like this. She glanced around. Prosecutor Richard Mallory was smiling triumphantly, whispering something to his assistant. Murmurs rose from the audience where reporters, family, and onlookers were watching closely. Jason swallowed, his hands clenching as the "resisting a law enforcement officer" label hung over him, even though the video evidence proved otherwise. Danielle placed a gentle hand on her brother's arm. "Stay calm, Jason," she whispered, her voice low but firm. "The truth will always come out. Just hold on a little longer." The heavy doors to the courtroom opened, and the noise died down. Judge Leonard Hawkins entered. He was about 65 years old with thinning white hair and a hooked nose, his eyes sharp and arrogant. His reputation preceded him, a ruthless man, known for his harsh, sometimes biased judgments. "The trial begins," the sheriff announced, his deep voice reverberating throughout the room. Judge Hawkins took his seat, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Danielle. The corners of his lips curled into a sneer, as if he already had a verdict in mind. "Come on," he muttered, loud enough for those sitting nearby to hear. "Let's get this over with." Danielle didn't blink. She'd met too many people like this. People who saw skin before they saw ability. People who judged appearance before they listened to words. They thought they had everything under control. They thought they were the law. Little did they know they were making a big mistake this time. She had dealt with men like him before. Men who saw her skin before they saw her abilities, judged her appearance before they heard her words. Danielle Carter took a deep breath, fighting the anger that was rising in her chest. She was used to the arrogance of men like Judge Leonard Hawkins, men who believed their power was absolute, that their biases could not be challenged. But this time, they were wrong. On the prosecution side, Richard Mallory stood up with a dramatic gesture. He adjusted his tie as if preparing for a theatrical performance. "Your Honor," he began, his voice filled with confidence, "the evidence against the defendant is overwhelming. This is a classic case of disregard for the law, and no amount of defense can erase that fact." Jason Carter, who was on trial, clenched his fists under the table. Danielle noticed this and placed a hand on her brother's arm, a gesture that reminded them to stay calm. Richard continued, his words painting Jason as dangerous, a menace to society. Every word was an exaggeration, half-truths twisted into accusations. Danielle felt her stomach tighten with anger. Finally, Richard sat down with a triumphant smile, as if he had won. Judge Hawkins turned to the defense attorney, a nervous young man who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "Well?" Hawkins barked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do you have anything to say? Or are we just going to waste our time here?" The attorney stammered a few words, his voice barely audible. Danielle felt a surge of frustration. This trial was headed in a direction no one could have predicted. If someone didn't step up and take control, Jason wouldn't stand a chance. As the proceedings progressed, Judge Hawkins' attitude became more and more clear. He repeatedly interrupted the defense, ignored objections, and even sighed when Danielle took the stand. "Miss Carter," Hawkins drawled, leaning back in his chair, his eyes full of mockery. "I hope you're not here to waste my time with sentimental stories. We're dealing with facts, not emotions." Danielle held her gaze, her voice unwavering. Your Honor, I'm here to tell the truth. That's it. Nothing more. A ripple of murmuring rippled through the courtroom, but Judge Hawkins quickly quelled it with a sharp look. All right, he sneered, his tone mocking. Let's see what you have to say. Danielle stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor, each step steady. All eyes were on her. She began to recount the events that led to Jason's arrest, painting a clear picture of a man targeted not for his actions, but for the prejudices of others. But every time she tried to elaborate, Judge Hawkins would interrupt. Miss Carter, he chuckled, you seem to think you're an expert in law enforcement. May I ask, do you have any real experience in this field, or are you just a couch potato? A few people in the courtroom laughed. Danielle felt anger flare in her chest, but she couldn't let it control her right now. She returned to the bar table and sat down, but in her head, a plan was already forming. Jason gritted his teeth, his knuckles white with anger. It's not over, Danielle whispered, her voice firm. Trust me, it's not over. Judge Hawkins thought he had all the power in this courtroom, but he had no idea he was about to face something he couldn't control. You're just another armchair activist, Judge Harrison Lawrence sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. Danielle Carter felt a flicker of anger ignite in her chest, but she forced it down. Not yet. Now wasn't the time. She returned to her seat, her expression calm, but the judge's laughter echoed in her ears, condescending and dismissive. She glanced at her younger brother, Jordan Carter, whose knuckles had turned white from gripping the edge of the table. His jaw was clenched, his frustration barely contained. It's not over, she whispered, her voice firm. Trust me, it's not over. Little did Judge Lorne know, the woman he had so easily dismissed was far more than she appeared, and soon the truth would shatter his smug confidence. The courtroom's energy was thick with tension, buzzing with unspoken words and barely contained anticipation. Every tick of the grand clock mounted high above the judge's bench seemed louder, as if counting down to an inevitable explosion. Danielle sat perfectly still, her composure a stark contrast to the storm raging beneath her calm exterior. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but never one so deeply personal. Across the room, Judge Lorne leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. His expression was one of thinly veiled contempt as he tapped his pen against the edge of his desk, a small, deliberate reminder of his authority. He wasn't just dismissing Danielle. He was challenging her very presence in his courtroom. All right, Miss Carter, Judge Lorne said, his tone patronizing. You've had your say. Now let's get back to the real issue, your brother's blatant disregard for the law. Danielle's fists clenched beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms. She inhaled slowly, a practiced technique from years of managing tense situations. Control the moment. Don't let the moment control you. It was a mantra that had carried her through the grueling challenges of her career. But here, under Judge Lorne's sneering gaze, it felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. The prosecutor, Mitchell Grayson, rose to his feet again, smoothing down his expensive suit as though preparing for an encore. Your Honor, he said, his voice smooth and calculated, I believe we've indulged in enough theatrics for one day. The evidence clearly shows that the defendant resisted arrest. Video or not, it is the officer's testimony that carries weight. Danielle's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile threatening to appear. She had reviewed that same video a dozen times. It wasn't just clear, it was damning. The arresting officer had escalated the situation without provocation, shoving Jordan to the ground and drawing his weapon over what should have been a routine traffic stop. But this wasn't just about the video. It was about power, bias, the carefully curated narratives that people like Judge Lorne and Mitchell Grayson spun to keep their status quo intact. Danielle leaned toward her brother, her voice barely above a whisper. They're pushing a story that won't hold up. She met his eyes, her own gaze steady. Stay strong, Jordan. This isn't over. This isn't over. Jordan Carter nodded, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. He had always been the strong one, the protector, but now seeing him vulnerable, shackled by a system designed to fail him, filled Danielle with a slow-burning anger she hadn't felt in years. Judge Harrison Lorne cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping the room before settling back on Danielle. Miss Carter, he began, his voice laced with smug condescension. "Before we move forward, I have to ask, what qualifies you to speak so passionately about law enforcement procedures? You seem quite confident for someone with no real-world experience." The question hung in the air, dripping with mockery. The spectators exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the judge's audacity. Danielle tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes narrowing just enough to convey her growing irritation. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she replied evenly, "I believe my testimony speaks for itself. I witnessed the events firsthand, and I've reviewed the evidence thoroughly." Judge Lorne chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that reverberated through the room. "Thoroughly, you say?" He leaned back, shaking his head as though speaking to a naive child. "And yet, you fail to recognize the limitations of your perspective. But please continue to enlighten us. After all, I'm sure your thorough review will somehow overturn years of legal precedent." A low rumble of muffled laughter spread through the courtroom, the kind Danielle had grown accustomed to, the laughter of those who underestimated her. But she didn't react. She didn't flinch. Instead, she held the judge's gaze, unblinking and unshaken. As the afternoon wore on, the defense attorney made a feeble attempt to introduce new evidence. Statements from witnesses who had seen the arrest, documentation of the officer's prior misconduct. But Judge Lorne waved it away with a dismissive hand. "This is irrelevant," he declared, his tone final. "We're not here to relitigate the past. We're here to address the facts of this case, not chase ghosts." Danielle's grip on the edge of the table tightened. She had seen this tactic before. Reduce, redirect, dismiss. It was a strategy designed to strip the defense of any foothold, to control the narrative before it could shift. And it was working. But Danielle had one advantage. Judge Lorne hadn't accounted for her patience. She wasn't here to play his game. She was here to end it. As the session drew to a close, Judge Lorne announced a brief recess. Danielle rose from her seat, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor as she stepped out into the hallway. The air outside the courtroom was cooler, but it did little to ease the tension coiled in her chest. Jordan followed close behind, his voice low and strained. "Danny, I don't know how much more of this I can take," he muttered. "That man, he's already made up his mind. It doesn't matter what we say." She turned to face him, her hands gripping his shoulders, grounding him. "Listen to me, Jordan," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't over. Not yet. And you don't have to fight this alone." He searched her eyes for a long moment, the weight of his fear and frustration palpable. Finally, he nodded. Jordan's shoulders relaxed slightly under Danielle's touch. She glanced back toward the heavy courtroom doors, her mind already racing. She had held back long enough. Let Judge Harrison Lorne dig his own grave with his arrogance. When the court reconvened, it would be time to act. Time to show the judge, the jury, and everyone else in that room exactly who she was. And this time, she wouldn't hold back. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as everyone filed back into their seats. The heavy doors groaned shut, sealing the tension in the room. Danielle Carter stepped back to the defendant's table, her heels clicking deliberately against the polished marble. Every step seemed measured, deliberate, yet filled with purpose. Jordan followed behind her, his head slightly bowed, but his shoulders a fraction less tense than before. Danielle had said something to him during the recess, something that steadied him. Whatever it was, he clung to it like a lifeline. Judge Harrison Lorne re-entered the room shortly after, his black robe billowing behind him like a cape of authority. He settled into his high-backed chair, his expression one of impatience mixed with self-satisfaction. To him, this case was a formality, just another cog in the machinery of justice, as he saw fit to define it. He tapped his gavel once. "Court is back in session," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. His eyes scanned the room, resting briefly on Danielle. The faintest smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He expected her to remain quiet, defeated even. But Danielle Carter had never been one to play to expectations. The prosecutor, Lucas Graham, wasted no time launching into his closing argument. His tone was sharp, confident, and rehearsed, each word carefully crafted to paint Jordan Carter as nothing more than a troublemaker. A man who resisted law enforcement and deserved the punishment the court would undoubtedly hand down. He waved dismissively toward the evidence the defense had attempted to introduce earlier, calling it a distraction, irrelevant to the facts. Danielle watched him carefully, her gaze steady and unyielding. Every word he spoke felt like another brick added to the wall Jordan was being forced to climb. But Danielle wasn't worried. Not yet. She had spent years mastering the art of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act. And that moment was fast approaching. When Graham finally sat down, Judge Lorne leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. His tone, as always, carried an edge of condescension. "Does the defense have any last-minute theatrics to present before we proceed to judgment?" Danielle Carter rose from her seat. Danielle glanced at the defense attorney, who hesitated, his confidence clearly shaken by the judge's dismissive attitude. Before he could speak, Danielle rose from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'd like to address the court directly." Judge Harrison Lorne raised an eyebrow, a mixture of amusement and irritation crossing his face. "Ms. Carter," he said, drawing out her name as if it were an inconvenience, "I believe I've given you more than enough time to share your thoughts. Unless you have something new, something relevant, to add, I suggest you sit down." Danielle didn't waver. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor, the sound echoing in the suddenly silent room. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying just enough edge to command attention, "I have something very relevant to say. Something I think this court needs to hear." The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed. "Very well," he said with a sigh, gesturing for her to proceed. "But make it quick. I have other cases to hear." Danielle stepped to the center of the courtroom, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Judge Lorne. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the collective tension thickening the air. But she didn't let it faze her. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small black wallet, flipping it open with practiced ease. The shiny badge inside caught the light, gleaming like a beacon in the dimly lit courtroom. "My name," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "is Special Agent Danielle Carter, United States Secret Service." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs, a ripple of shock spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The prosecutor's jaw visibly tightened, his earlier confidence evaporating in an instant. Even the defense attorney, who had been fumbling through the case, looked up in stunned silence. Judge Lorne, however, remained frozen in his seat, his expression one of disbelief mingled with growing unease. His smirk faltered, and for the first time that day, he seemed at a loss for words. Danielle didn't wait for him to respond. She continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "I have spent the last 10 years serving this country, protecting its leaders, upholding its laws. And I will not stand by while this courtroom, or any courtroom, twists justice to fit a narrative of prejudice and power." The judge finally found his voice, though it wavered slightly. "Agent Carter," he began, his tone no longer carrying the same air of superiority, "I fail to see how your credentials are relevant to this case." Danielle's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, they're very relevant, Your Honor," she replied, "because they speak to my experience, my integrity, and my ability to recognize when someone is abusing their position of power." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the judge to respond, but he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, the room fell into a tense silence, voice steady. "In that time, I have conducted investigations, protected national leaders, and upheld the principles of justice that this country was founded on. My badge is not just a symbol of authority, it is a commitment to truth, fairness, and the rule of law." Her words echoed through the room, each syllable carrying weight. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, fidgeted in his seat, his earlier confidence now replaced by a nervous energy. He glanced toward Judge Whitman, silently willing him to regain control of the narrative. But Judge Whitman seemed frozen, his usually sharp tongue dulled by the sheer force of Angela's presence. Angela turned her attention to the jury, her gaze sweeping across their faces. "You've been asked to make a judgment today," she said, her tone softening but losing none of its strength. "But how can we expect justice to be served when the scales are tipped before the trial even begins? My brother Marcus has been painted as a criminal, not because of his actions, but because of the color of his skin, And that bias didn't start with the arresting officer. It permeates every level of the system, including this courtroom. A murmur rippled through the spectators, the weight of her words sinking in. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She glanced toward the judge, then back at Angela, as though re-evaluating everything she had heard so far. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control. "Ms. Monroe," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Agent Monroe," Angela corrected, her tone razor-sharp. The correction landed like a slap, silencing him instantly. "And with all due respect, Your Honor, I'm not finished." The judge's mouth opened, then closed again. He leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and humiliation. For the first time in his long career, he was powerless to dictate the flow of his own courtroom. Angela returned to the defendant's table, placing her badge carefully on the wooden surface. It sat there, a silent reminder of her authority, glinting in the light as if daring anyone to challenge it. She placed her hands flat on the table and leaned forward, addressing the entire room. "The evidence is clear," she said, her voice steady. "The video shows Marcus being pushed to the ground without cause. Witnesses have testified to the officer's aggressive behavior. Yet this court has chosen to dismiss those facts, to ignore the truth, in favor of a narrative that fits a deeply ingrained bias." She straightened, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But I will not allow my brother, or anyone else, to be railroaded by a system that values power over justice. Not today, not ever." The room erupted into hushed whispers, the tension reaching a boiling point. Angela stepped back, her posture calm but firm, and returned to her seat beside Marcus. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, pride. Judge Whitman sat motionless for a moment, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual authority. "Agent Monroe," he said, each word carefully measured, "while your credentials are impressive, they do not grant you the right to undermine this court." Angela met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here to undermine this court, Your Honor. I'm here to ensure that justice is served. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it's worth asking yourself why." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. He glanced toward the prosecutor, who was now frantically flipping through his notes, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. But there was nothing he could say, nothing he could do, to undo the shift in power that Angela had created. The courtroom sat in tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone in the room knew that something monumental had just occurred, though the full weight of it had yet to settle. Judge Whitman adjusted his robe, his movements stiff and mechanical. "This court will take a recess," he announced, his voice lacking its usual force. "We will reconvene shortly." He banged his gavel and rose from his seat, his robe billowing behind him as he exited the room. But the sound of the gavel, meant to signify authority, felt hollow, like the last gasp of a man who had lost control of his own kingdom. Angela watched him go, her expression unreadable. She turned to Marcus and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Not by a long shot." And as the doors closed behind the judge, Angela knew that the battle was far from finished. But for the first time, the tide had turned, and justice felt just within reach. Back, her posture calm but firm, and returned to her seat beside Marcus. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, pride. Judge Whitman sat motionless for a moment, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual authority. "Agent Monroe," he said, each word carefully measured, "while your credentials are impressive, they do not grant you the right to undermine this court." Angela met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here to undermine this court, Your Honor. I'm here to ensure that justice is served. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it's worth asking yourself why." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. He glanced toward the prosecutor, who was now frantically flipping through his notes, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. But there was nothing he could say, nothing he could do, to undo the shift in power that Angela had created. The courtroom sat in tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone in the room knew that something monumental had just occurred, though the full weight of it had yet to settle. Judge Whitman adjusted his robe, his movements stiff and mechanical. "This court will take a recess," he announced, his voice lacking its usual force. "We will reconvene shortly." He banged his gavel and rose from his seat, his robe billowing behind him as he exited the room. But the sound of the gavel, meant to signify authority, felt hollow, like the last gasp of a man who had lost control of his own kingdom. Angela watched him go, her expression unreadable. She turned to Marcus and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Not by a long shot." And as the doors closed behind the judge, Angela knew that the battle was far from finished. But for the first time, the tide had turned, and justice felt just within reach. Marcus nodded, but his unease was still evident. "Do you think it's enough? Do you think he'll actually listen?" Angela's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a small crack in her otherwise stoic exterior. "Judges like Whitman don't listen, Marcus. They react. And when they're cornered, they either double down or crumble under the weight of their own hubris. Either way, we're ready." The recess stretched on longer than anyone expected. Outside the courtroom doors, the corridors of the county courthouse buzzed with activity. Reporters who had initially ignored the case were now gathered in clusters, their notebooks and cameras at the ready. News of Angela's revelation had spread like wildfire, and the courthouse had become a hive of speculation. Angela remained seated at the defense table, her back straight, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She didn't flinch under the curious stares of the onlookers who had lingered in the gallery. Some looked at her with admiration, others with skepticism, but none could ignore the quiet authority she exuded. Finally, the heavy double doors opened, and the bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise! Court is back in session." Angela stood slowly, her movements deliberate. Beside her, Marcus rose as well, his breathing steady but shallow. Judge Whitman entered the room, his face flushed, but his expression tightly controlled. If the recess had given him time to collect himself, it was clear he still hadn't regained the full confidence he had wielded earlier. He took his seat, his gavel clutched tightly in one hand. For a moment, he simply sat there, his gaze sweeping the room as though daring anyone to challenge his authority. But the cracks in his demeanor were evident, a slight tremor in his hand, a tightness around his mouth. Angela saw it all. "Before we proceed," Judge Whitman began, his voice carefully measured, "I feel it necessary to remind this court of the rules of decorum. While Agent Monroe's credentials are notable, they do not grant her immunity from the standards of conduct expected in this courtroom." Angela met his gaze evenly, her expression unchanging. She said nothing, allowing the weight of her silence to settle over the room. It wasn't defiance, it was control, and it unnerved the judge more than any outburst ever could. Jordan nodded, but his unease was still evident. "Do you think it's enough? Do you think he'll actually listen?" he asked quietly. A faint, ironic smile tugged at the corners of Danielle Carter's lips, a subtle crack in her otherwise stoic exterior. "Judges like Harrison Lorne don't listen, Jordan. They react, and when they're cornered, they either double down or crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. Either way, we're ready." The recess stretched on longer than anyone had anticipated. Outside the double doors of the Jackson County Courthouse, the corridors buzzed with activity. Reporters who had barely paid attention to the case at first now clustered together, notebooks and cameras at the ready. News of Danielle's credentials had spread like wildfire, transforming the courthouse into a hive of speculation. Danielle remained seated at the defense table, her back straight, hands clasped lightly in front of her. She didn't flinch under the curious gazes of onlookers in the gallery. Some regarded her with admiration, others with skepticism, but no one could deny the quiet authority she radiated. Finally, the heavy wooden doors opened, and the bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise! Court is back in session." Danielle stood slowly, her movements deliberate. Beside her, Jordan rose as well, his breathing even but tense. Judge Lorne entered, his face flushed, though his expression remained tightly controlled. If the break had given him time to steady himself, he still hadn't reclaimed the unshakable confidence he displayed earlier. He settled into his seat, gavel clutched in one hand. For a moment, he simply sat there, his gaze surveying the room, as though daring anyone to test his authority. But the cracks in his demeanor showed, a subtle tremor in his hand, a strained tightness around his lips. Danielle noticed every detail. "Before we proceed," Judge Lorne began, his voice measured, "I feel it necessary to remind this court of the rules of decorum. While Agent Carter's credentials may be noteworthy, they do not exempt her from the standard conduct required in this courtroom." Danielle met his stare evenly, her face impassive. She remained silent, allowing the weight of that silence to settle over the room. This was not defiance, but rather a cool exercise of control, one that unnerved the judge far more than any outburst could have. Sensing an opening, Prosecutor Lucas Graham rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to bring our attention back to the facts of this case. Agent Carter's testimony, while dramatic, is ultimately irrelevant to the specific charges." A tension rippled through Danielle's jaw, but she kept her composure. She recognized this tactic all too well. Minimize, redirect, and undermine. It was the playbook of those who sensed their authority slipping. Yet Danielle also knew that facts had a way of cutting through even the thickest veil of arrogance. Bolstered by Danielle Carter's presence, the defense attorney rose to his feet. His voice, now firmer than before, rang out. "Your Honor," he said, "Agent Carter's testimony is not only relevant, it's critical. The video evidence she reviewed, the witnesses she spoke to, these aren't just opinions. They're verifiable facts that this court has a duty to consider." Judge Harrison Lorne let out a heavy sigh, the sound thick with frustration. "Enough," he snapped, his voice cracking slightly. "We will review the evidence once more, but I will not allow this court to turn into a spectacle." The bailiff stepped forward, setting up the video evidence on the courtroom's projector. The screen flickered to life, revealing the grainy footage of Jordan Carter's arrest. Danielle watched carefully, her eyes scanning every frame, despite having memorized the details long ago. The damning evidence didn't point at Jordan. It pointed at the officer who had escalated the situation without cause. A hushed silence fell over the room as the video played. The officer's sharp commands clashed with Jordan's composed responses, echoing throughout the courtroom. The moment the officer shoved Jordan to the ground replayed in slow motion, his body striking the pavement with a sickening thud. Gasps rippled among the spectators, followed by uneasy murmurs. Danielle glanced at the jury, observing their shifting expressions, doubt, unease, even guilt. The truth was finally beginning to break through. When the video ended, Judge Lorne leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "The evidence is clear," he said, his tone strained, "but that doesn't excuse the defendant's actions." Danielle rose from her seat, her movements measured and deliberate. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "this evidence doesn't merely excuse my brother, it exonerates him. What this court has witnessed today isn't just the truth, but the reality of a system that fails to uphold justice for everyone." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The spectators sat in silence, a collective weight pressing down on them like a stone. Judge Lorne's expression darkened. His hands clenched the edges of his bench. "Agent Carter," he said, his tone icy, "you're walking a fine line." Danielle stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "No, Your Honor," she said softly but firmly. "I'm walking the only line that matters, the line of truth." The courtroom erupted into whispers, tension mounting to a boiling point. Judge Lorne banged his gavel, a harsh, jarring sound. "Order!" he barked, his voice trembling. "I will have order in my courtroom." But the authority in his voice was gone, replaced by something far closer to desperation. Danielle returned to her seat, her expression calm yet resolute. She had done what she came to do. Now it was up to the system to decide whether it would rise to the challenge or buckle under its own failures. When the judge struck his gavel once more, it felt less like a declaration of authority and more like a final, desperate act from a man who no longer controlled his own court. Struggling to maintain the illusion of control as the court adjourned for the day, Danielle Carter placed a reassuring hand on her brother's shoulder. "This isn't the end," she said quietly, "but we're closer than we've ever been." Jordan nodded, his eyes reflecting a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually be within reach. And as the courtroom doors closed behind them, Danielle knew the fight was far from finished. but she was ready for whatever came next. The hallways of the Edgewood County Courthouse were unusually quiet as Danielle Carter walked side by side with her younger brother. Their footsteps echoed against the polished marble floors. Danielle's face remained calm, her expression unreadable, but Jordan could see the subtle tension in the tightness of her jaw, the way her fingers twitched as though gripping an invisible weight. Finally, Jordan broke the silence. "Do you really think he'll let the evidence change anything?" he asked, voice low and uncertain. "Or is this just another show where they pretend to listen but already know how it'll end?" Danielle paused, turning to face him. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a soft glow on her features. For a moment, she simply studied her brother's face. "Jordan," she said gently, "I've been in rooms with people who believe they control everything. People with power, influence, and the arrogance to match. They all have one thing in common. They crumble when the truth comes out. Judge Lorne is no different. He knows the walls are closing in." Jordan looked at her, his shoulders sagging slightly. "But what if he still finds a way to twist this? What if he just—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Danielle squeezed his shoulder, grounding him. "If he twists it, we untwist," she said, voice unwavering. "If he blocks the truth, we push harder. This isn't just about you, Jordan. It's about everyone who's ever stepped into a courtroom and been judged before they even spoke, and I won't stop until they see that." Her words were resolute, and for the first time that day, Jordan allowed himself a small smile. "You always know what to say," he murmured. Danielle's lips curved into the slightest grin. "Comes with the territory," she replied. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. At first it was subtle, just a whisper of tension in the way the spectators spoke among themselves, the way the bailiff's eyes lingered on Judge Lorne as he re-entered. But Danielle could feel it, and she knew it was more than simply fallout from her earlier revelation. Judge Lorne took his seat. His movements were more rigid than before, his face carefully neutral. But Danielle saw the signs, the faint lines of strain around his eyes, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the gavel, as though testing its weight. Though testing its weight, Judge Harrison Lorne cleared his throat, the sound loud and sharp in the otherwise silent room. "This court is prepared to hear closing arguments," he announced, his voice carrying a forced authority. "However, I would remind everyone present that this is a court of law, not a stage for personal grievances or theatrics." Danielle Carter met his gaze from across the room, her expression unflinching. If he thought his thinly veiled warning would intimidate her, he was mistaken. Prosecutor Lucas Graham rose to deliver his closing statement. He adjusted his tie, stepping to the center of the courtroom, his usual confidence restored, or at least carefully performed. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "What we have witnessed here today is a distraction. The defense has tried to shift focus away from the facts of this case, presenting irrelevant testimony and emotional appeals that have no bearing on the charges against the defendant." He paced slowly, his eyes scanning the jury. "The truth is simple. Jordan Carter resisted arrest. The evidence supports this. The officer's testimony supports this. And while the defense may wish to muddy the waters, the law is clear." Danielle watched him carefully, her expression neutral. She did not interrupt or blink. She had learned long ago that silence could be its own kind of power, and she wielded it now with precision. Graham concluded his statement with a flourish, returning to his seat wearing a smug smile. But as he sat down, Danielle caught a glimpse of doubt in his eyes, the faintest crack in his composure. When the defense attorney rose to speak, Danielle leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. The young lawyer's earlier nerves had melted away, replaced by a quiet determination that Danielle recognized as the result of her own stance. She had given him courage, and now he was using it. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice steady, "this case is not about resisting arrest. It's about accountability. It's about recognizing when those in positions of power have abused that power, and it's about ensuring that justice is not just a word we say, but a principle we uphold." He gestured toward the screen where the video evidence had been shown earlier. "You've seen the footage. You've heard the testimony. Jordan Carter did not resist arrest. He was assaulted, humiliated, and wrongfully accused, and this court has a duty to acknowledge that truth. As he spoke, Danielle glanced at the jury. She could see the impact of his words on their faces, the softening of their expressions, the way their eyes shifted toward Jordan with something akin to understanding. The attorney finished his statement, his voice radiating quiet conviction. "Justice demands courage. I urge you to show that courage today." The attorney sat down, and the room fell into a heavy silence. All eyes turned to Judge Harrison Lorne, who sat motionless, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he merely stared at the papers before him, his fingers skimming the edge of his gavel. Finally, he looked up, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "The jury will now deliberate," he announced, his voice tight. "Court is adjourned until a verdict is reached." He banged his gavel and rose abruptly, exiting the room before anyone had the chance to speak. The bailiff instructed everyone to remain seated until the judge left, and then the room erupted into a low hum of murmurs. Danielle Carter turned to her brother Jordan, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "This is it," she said quietly. "Now we wait." Jordan nodded, his hands fidgeting slightly on the table. "Do you think they'll see it? The jury, I mean." Danielle placed a steadying hand on his arm. "They saw it, Jordan. They just have to decide if they're brave enough to act on it." As the courtroom slowly emptied, Danielle remained seated, her mind churning through every detail, every possibility. She knew the fight wasn't over, not yet, but she also knew that truth had a way of surfacing, even in the darkest of places. For now, all they could do was wait. The wait was agonizing. Hours crept by, the clock on the courtroom wall ticking forward with a mocking slowness. Danielle and Jordan sat at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap, her composure seemingly unbreakable. Inwardly, however, her thoughts swirled with cautious hope and nagging doubt. She understood the system didn't always favor the truth. It favored those who controlled the narrative. And for so long, Judge Lorne, and men like him, had been the ones in control. Jordan shifted beside her, the weight of uncertainty bearing down on his broad shoulders. "Danielle," he whispered, breaking the silence. "What if this doesn't go our way?" She turned to him, her gaze steady and calm. "Then we keep fighting. This case is just one battle, Jordan. The war for justice is bigger than this room, bigger than any single verdict. You're not alone in this." Her words weren't only for him, they were for herself as well. She had to believe in the resilience of truth, even in a system designed to suppress it. Finally, the bailiff opened the door and stepped inside. "All rise," he called, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "The jury has reached a verdict." The spectators shuffled to their feet, the air thick with anticipation. Danielle rose slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer. Jordan stood beside her, his hands trembling at his sides, and she placed a hand on his arm to ground him. Judge Lorne re-entered, his expression carefully neutral, though Danielle caught the slight stiffness in his movements and the way he avoided her gaze as he took his seat. The gavel struck the desk with a sharp crack, and the courtroom fell silent. "Be seated," Judge Lorne said. Judge Harrison Lorne gave the command, and the room obeyed in unison, the creak of wooden benches filling the sudden silence. The foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a nervous demeanor, stood, holding a folded piece of paper that seemed impossibly small for the weight it carried. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, "the jury has reached a unanimous decision." Danielle Carter's heart thumped steadily, her calm exterior concealing the storm of emotions within. She glanced at her brother Jordan, who stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. This was it, the moment that would determine not just his fate, but a measure of justice in a system that had failed so many. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Lorne instructed, his voice devoid of emotion. Jordan stood, his broad frame somehow appearing smaller under the weight of the judge's gaze. Danielle rose beside him, her presence a quiet yet powerful show of solidarity. The foreperson unfolded the paper, her hands shaking slightly. She glanced at Jordan, then at the judge before reading aloud. "On the charge of resisting arrest," she said, voice unsteady, "we find the defendant, Jordan Carter, not guilty." For a moment the words hung in the air, as if the room itself needed time to absorb them. Then, like a dam bursting, a wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Some gasped in relief, others in disbelief. Danielle closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Beside her, Jordan's knees buckled, and she steadied him with a firm hand on his arm. "Order!" Judge Lorne barked, banging his gavel. "I will have order in this courtroom." The noise subsided, but the tension did not. The judge's face was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced at Danielle, his eyes flickering with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Resentment, perhaps, or the sting of being outmaneuvered. Regardless, she met his gaze without flinching. "The defendant is free to go," Lorne said curtly, the words forced through gritted teeth. "This court is adjourned." He struck the gavel one final time and rose, his robe billowing behind him as he left the room without another word. The courtroom erupted the instant he was gone. Jordan turned to Danielle, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Danny," he whispered, voice cracking, "we did it." "No," she replied softly, her expression warm but resolute. "You did it. The truth did it." He pulled her into a tight embrace, his shoulders shaking as weeks of tension finally released in a surge of relief. Danielle held him, her arms strong and steady, a quiet anchor in the turmoil around them. Reporters swarmed in, camera flashes popping, questions flying, but Danielle ignored them, keeping her focus on her brother. This wasn't their moment to exploit. It was Jordan's moment to reclaim his dignity, his humanity, and his life. And as they left the courthouse, Danielle knew that while the battle had been won, the fight for true justice was far from over. Dining table. Those words hadn't been spoken out loud, but the case against the arresting officer gained momentum in the wake of Jordan Carter's acquittal. The cool air of Bayfield hit them like a shockwave as they stepped outside the courthouse. The noise of the crowd followed them, but Danielle Carter guided Jordan toward a quieter corner of the steps. She turned to him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. "This isn't the end, Jordan," she said, her voice both firm and gentle. "It's just the beginning. What happened to you isn't unique. It's systemic, and we can't stop here. We have to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Jordan nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and determination. "I'll do whatever it takes, Danny. I'll fight, just like you." Danielle offered him a rare, soft smile, something her otherwise guarded demeanor seldom revealed. "You've already fought, Jordan, and you've already won." She glanced back at the courthouse, its imposing structure standing like a stern reminder of the battles yet to come. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to breathe, knowing they had taken one small yet significant step toward justice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and crimson, Danielle Carter walked away from the courthouse with her brother by her side, ready for whatever came next. The courthouse steps were still buzzing with life as Danielle and Jordan descended them, flanked by reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Camera flashes popped like fireworks, a vivid reminder that this moment had transcended any single courtroom. Danielle remained composed, her arm gently guiding Jordan through the chaos, shielding him from the barrage of scrutiny. "Agent Carter," a reporter shouted, "what's your next move now that your brother's been acquitted? Will you press charges against the officer involved?" Danielle didn't break stride, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "Today is about my brother and his freedom," she said firmly, her voice calm yet unyielding. "The fight for justice doesn't end here, but for now, we're taking a moment to breathe." The crowd parted at the bottom of the steps, granting the siblings a brief reprieve from the spotlight. Danielle led Jordan toward a waiting car, its sleek black exterior reflecting the last rays of sunlight. A driver stepped out, opening the door, but Jordan hesitated, turning to face his sister. "Danny," he said, voice low, "I don't know how to thank you. I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for you." Danielle placed a steady hand on his shoulder, her gaze unwavering. "You don't have to thank me, Jordan. You're my brother. I'll always stand up for you. But what happens next? That's up to you. Use this freedom to make a difference, to become the man I know you can be." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I will." Months later, Danielle sat in her modest yet neatly kept apartment, reviewing a stack of documents spread across her desk. Jordan Carter's acquittal, fueled by public outrage and the undeniable evidence presented in court, sparked a wave of activism. Community leaders, legal experts, and even a few politicians began calling for deeper investigations into systemic biases throughout the justice system. In the midst of it all, Danielle Carter found herself stepping into a role she had never anticipated, an advocate, not just for her brother, but for countless others wronged by a flawed system. Balancing her career as an FBI special agent with her new mission, she spoke at community forums, met with legal reform organizations, and lent her voice to the growing demand for accountability. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the papers scattered across her desk. It was Jordan. "Hey, Danny," he said, his voice carrying a lightness she hadn't heard in years. "I spoke at a youth center today, told my story. A lot of those kids are going through what I went through. I think it made a difference." Danielle smiled, pride swelling in her chest. "That's amazing, Jordan. I'm proud of you." "You should have seen their faces," he continued. "I told them what you always tell me, that the fight isn't over, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting." Leaning back in her chair, Danielle felt her heart fill with gratitude. "You're doing good work, Jordan. Keep going." They chatted a few more minutes before hanging up. Danielle sat in the calm of her apartment, her thoughts drifting. The road ahead would be long, filled with battles yet to be won. But moments like this reminded her why she continued. A few weeks later, Danielle stood at the front of a packed auditorium. Bright stage lights cast her in sharp relief, illuminating an audience of community members, lawyers, students, and activists who had gathered to discuss systemic reform. Invited not as an agent of the FBI, but as a sister, a witness, and a fighter for justice, she stepped up to the podium. The crowd fell silent. "Justice is not guaranteed," she began, her voice steady yet full of conviction. "It's something we must fight for, something we must demand. My brother's story is only one among many, but it proves that when we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced, change becomes possible." She paused, letting her words resonate. "This isn't just about Jordan or about me. It's about every person who has been dismissed, silenced, or judged unfairly. It's about building a system that values humanity over prejudice, truth over power." The crowd erupted in applause, but Danielle stood still, her gaze sweeping the room. She felt the weight of her words and the responsibility they carried. Yet for the first time in a long while, a quiet, unwavering hope stirred within her. Hope that, through collective effort, those ripples of change could become formidable waves. As Danielle stepped back from the podium, the applause rising around her, she knew the fight was far from over. But she finally felt ready. She had discovered her purpose, not merely in protecting others, but in speaking up for what was right. And as the audience rose to its feet, their voices uniting in a swell of support, Danielle Carter left the stage with her head held high, prepared to face whatever came next. The story of Danielle Carter and Jordan Carter extends beyond exposing an unjust trial to a message of determination, perseverance, and belief in justice. In today's world, many people may feel oppressed by the system or face prejudice and injustice. However, from the journey of these two characters, we can draw practical lessons. Be brave to speak up. If you encounter or witness injustice, collect evidence, seek support from the community, and do not be afraid to bring the truth to light. Like Danielle, assertiveness can help you create big changes. Stand firm. In the face of pressure from powerful forces, confidence in your own righteousness and values is extremely important. Trust in the process, even if the results are sometimes not as expected. Perseverance will take you further. Building community. Danielle does not fight alone. She has support from her family and community. In life, finding like-minded people who are willing to support and call for justice together will help your voice gain more weight. Willing to improve the system. The core of the story is not only to exonerate Jordan, but also to promote reform and increase the responsibility of lawmakers. In today's society, if you see shortcomings or unreasonable things, report them to the authorities or participate in social activities to change from the roots. Continuously learn and improve. Danielle is a professional agent, but she is still willing to listen and cooperate with social organizations to pursue justice. In life, knowledge and cooperation with many different parties help you gain more understanding, expand relationships, and get closer to solutions. Advice: start with small things, such as speaking up when you see injustice in your workplace or residential area. Find ways to prove the truth with concrete evidence, and always remember that you are not alone. There are people out there willing to support you if you dare to take action. In the long journey of changing perceptions and systems, each step can be very effective. If you love this story and want to continue to accompany, like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss the latest content. Hit the notification bell to always update stories, lessons, and inspirational sharing. Share the video with friends and relatives to spread positive values together. Thank you for your support, and see you again in the next interesting content.